I never thought I'd return to Miller's auction barn, but here I was, standing among the familiar faces that had shaped my childhood. The scent of hay and old wood triggered memories I'd buried for 15 years. Today wasn't about nostalgia, though. Today was about justice. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the barn as lot after lot of farm equipment changed hands. I kept my head down, baseball cap pulled low, hoping to remain unnoticed until the moment that mattered. My heart pounded as I watched neighbors bid on tractors and plows that once belonged to hard-working families, now forced to sell. I'd driven 8 hours from the city, taking time off from my consulting firm to be here. My colleagues would never understand why a successful businesswoman would waste a Saturday at a rural auction. They didn't know about the land. They didn't know about the promise I'd made to myself years ago. The barn buzzed with conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Farmers in worn boots and faded jeans mingled with dealers looking for bargains. Some faces I recognized, aged but familiar. Others were strangers, probably here for the main event like me. I checked my watch. The land auction would begin in an hour. Everything leading up to this moment had been preparation, planning, and painful memories I'd had to confront. The research, the financing, the legal consultations, all of it led to this barn, this day, this chance at redemption. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant confirming the wire transfer had cleared. The funds were ready. I had enough to outbid anyone who showed up today, no matter who they were or what they represented. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about setting things right and honoring the legacy that had been stolen from my family. Growing up, I'd spent countless summer afternoons helping my grandmother tend to her vegetable garden behind the old farmhouse. She'd tell stories about my great-grandfather, who'd purchased the land in 1923 with money saved from working the railroad. 3 generations of our family had worked that soil, raised children there, and built a life worth passing down. My grandmother's hands were always gentle, whether she was pulling weeds or braiding my hair. She taught me that land wasn't just property, it was responsibility, legacy and love, wrapped up in acres of possibilities. Every seed planted was an investment in the future, every harvest a celebration of patience and hard work. The farmhouse held decades of memories, holiday dinners where the table groaned under the weight of home-cooked food, birthday parties in the backyard where cousins ran through sprinklers and played hide-and-seek among the apple trees, Christmas mornings when the whole extended family gathered to exchange gifts and share stories by the fireplace. My grandmother would sit on the front porch in her rocking chair every evening, watching the sun set over fields that stretched to the horizon. She'd wave at passing neighbors and call out greetings to anyone who stopped by. Everyone was welcome at her table, and no one ever left hungry or empty-handed. When I was 12, she started teaching me about the family documents kept in the old oak desk. Property deeds, tax records, photographs dating back to the early 1900s. She made me promise to always remember where I came from, no matter how far life might take me from this place. I'd kept that promise, even when keeping it became painful. Even when other family members made choices that threatened everything my grandmother had worked to preserve. Some promises are worth any price, and today I was prepared to prove it. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in October, 15 years ago. I was 25, fresh out of business school, and starting my first real job in Chicago. My mother's voice was thick with tears as she explained that my uncle had made a decision that would change everything. Uncle Robert had always been the black sheep of the family. While others worked to preserve what my great-grandfather had built, Robert saw dollar signs and quick solutions. When my grandmother passed away the previous spring, she'd left the land to be shared among her children, trusting them to keep it in the family. Robert had other plans. Drowning in gambling debts and facing bankruptcy, He'd convinced my mother and her siblings to sell their shares to him for far less than market value. He promised to keep the land in the family, to preserve my grandmother's legacy, to honor the trust she'd placed in all of us. Instead, he'd immediately sold everything to a development company: the farmhouse where 5 generations had lived, the fields where my ancestors had grown crops and raised livestock, the barn where I'd learned to milk cows and stack hay. All of it was gone within 6 months. I drove home for the last time that December, watching as bulldozers tore down the house where my grandmother had taught me to bake bread. The apple orchard was already gone, replaced by survey stakes marking future housing lots. My childhood, my heritage, my family's legacy, all reduced to raw land ready for development. Standing in what used to be my grandmother's kitchen, I made a promise. Someday, when I had the means and the opportunity, I would bring this land back into our family. I would right the wrong that had been done, no matter how long it took or what it cost me. The years that followed were driven by a single goal: accumulating the resources necessary to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I threw myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. While friends were dating, partying, and enjoying their 20s, I was building a consulting business that would give me the financial power I needed. My specialty became corporate restructuring and acquisitions. I learned how to evaluate assets, negotiate deals, and outmaneuver opponents in boardrooms across the country. Every successful contract brought me closer to my goal. Every bonus payment went straight into an investment account earmarked for one purpose. I studied the development company that had purchased our family land. Richmond Holdings was a mid-sized firm specializing in residential developments in rural areas. They'd purchased several properties in our county, turning farmland into suburban neighborhoods with names like Country Manor Estates and Heritage Hills. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd used words like heritage to market developments built on land, stripped away from families who'd actually created that heritage. Marketing departments had a way of sanitizing the destruction of generational wealth and calling it progress. I researched every project Richmond Holdings had completed, every investor involved, every loan agreement filed with the county. I learned about their financing structures, their profit margins, and their decision-making processes. Knowledge was power, and I was accumulating both with methodical precision. Most importantly, I kept track of our family land. The development had stalled during the 2008 recession, leaving our property partially developed and tied up in legal battles. Richmond Holdings had overextended themselves, and our land had become a liability rather than an asset. That gave me hope and time to prepare for the opportunity I knew would eventually come. The phone call from my lawyer came on a Wednesday morning in March. Richmond Holdings was finally liquidating their troubled assets, including our family land. Everything would be sold at public auction in 60 days. After 15 years of waiting and planning, my chance had arrived. I immediately called my financial advisor to begin liquidating investments. The numbers were staggering, far more than our small farm had ever been worth, but development potential and 15 years of appreciation had inflated the value significantly. I would need to bid aggressively to ensure success. The legal research took weeks. I had to understand every aspect of the sale, every potential complication, every possible challenge to my ownership once I won the auction. My law firm earned their fees thoroughly, preparing documentation and contingency plans for every scenario we could imagine. I also had to confront the reality that I might not be the only one interested in this property. Other developers might see the same potential Richmond Holdings had originally recognized. Local farmers might want to return productive agricultural land to farming. There could be competing interests I hadn't anticipated. The most painful preparation involved researching my Uncle Robert. He'd never fully recovered from the financial crisis that had forced him to sell our family land. Multiple bankruptcies, failed businesses, and ongoing legal troubles had marked the years since his betrayal. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a larger part remembered my grandmother's broken trust. I learned he was still living in the area, working odd jobs and struggling to make ends meet. Some family members had maintained contact with him over the years, but I'd cut all ties after the land sale. Today would be the first time I'd seen him since my grandmother's funeral, and I had no idea how he'd react to my presence at the auction. Driving into my hometown after years away felt surreal. Main Street looked smaller than I remembered, with several storefronts empty and others converted to antique shops and craft stores. The grain elevator still dominated the skyline, but many of the surrounding farm buildings had disappeared or fallen into disrepair. I drove past the site where our farmhouse had once stood. A partially completed subdivision occupied the space now, with about half the planned homes built before construction had stopped. Weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalks, and several of the completed houses showed signs of abandonment or neglect. The irony was bitter. Richmond Holdings had destroyed our family farm to build a neighborhood that never fully materialized. The land that had supported 5 generations of my family now sat partially developed and largely empty, a monument to corporate short-sightedness and financial speculation. I parked at the edge of the development and walked through what had once been my grandmother's garden. Construction debris was scattered around, mixed with remnants of the natural landscape that had somehow survived the developers' bulldozers. A few apple trees from the original orchard had been incorporated into the landscaping of completed homes. Standing where my grandmother's kitchen had been, I felt the full weight of what had been lost and what I was trying to recover. This wasn't just about buying back property. This was about restoring dignity to my family's legacy and ensuring that my grandmother's sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The auction was tomorrow. Tonight, I would stay in a hotel in the county seat, reviewing my strategy and preparing mentally for what might be the most important day of my adult life. Everything I'd worked for over the past 15 years would be decided in a few hours at Miller's auction barn. I arrived at Miller's auction barn early, wanting to observe the crowd and identify potential competitors before the bidding began. The parking lot was fuller than I'd expected, with vehicles ranging from farm trucks to luxury SUVs. Word had gotten out about the auction, and interest was clearly high. Inside the barn, I recognized several faces from my childhood, though most didn't seem to recognize me. 15 years of city living had changed my appearance considerably. I was no longer the young woman who'd left town in anger and heartbreak. I was a successful businesswoman with the resources to back up my determination. The auctioneer was setting up his equipment when I noticed a familiar figure near the back of the crowd. Uncle Robert looked older than his 60 years, his face weathered by hard living and harder choices. He was talking quietly with a man I didn't recognize, their conversation animated and serious. My stomach tightened as I realized Robert might be here for the same reason I was. Did he have the resources to compete with me? Had he found investors or partners willing to back his bid? The possibility that he might try to reclaim the land he'd originally sold filled me with a mixture of anger and determination. I moved closer, trying to overhear their conversation without being noticed. The man with Robert was well-dressed and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to financial negotiations. They were discussing bidding strategies and maximum amounts, confirming my worst fears. When Robert finally noticed me, the recognition was immediate and uncomfortable. His expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like shame, then hardened into defensive resentment. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, and the weight of that silence filled the space between us like a physical barrier. The auction would begin in 30 minutes. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd planned, would be decided soon. Looking at my uncle across the barn, I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming family land. This was about confronting the past and ensuring that history wouldn't repeat itself. Robert approached me during the final setup before the auction began. His steps were hesitant, but his expression was determined. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd spent years making excuses for choices he couldn't undo. "I heard you might be here," he said, stopping just close enough for private conversation. "Didn't think you'd actually show up, though. This isn't your world anymore, is it?" I kept my voice steady, professional. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else. The auction is public." His laugh was bitter. "Right. The successful city girl comes back to play farmer for a day. You think you can just waltz in here and buy back something you never really understood in the first place?" The accusation stung because it touched on doubts I'd carried for years. Had I romanticized our family's connection to the land? Was I trying to reclaim something that existed more in memory than reality? But looking at Robert, I remembered why I was really here. "I understood enough to know it shouldn't have been sold," I replied. "Grandmother trusted all of us to preserve what she'd built." "Don't lecture me about trust," Robert snapped. "You disappeared for 15 years, never called, never visited, never cared about what happened to any of us after you left. Now you show up with your fancy clothes and your city money, thinking you can fix everything." The people around us were starting to notice our conversation. I could feel eyes turning our way, curious about the drama unfolding before the main event. This wasn't how I'd wanted this day to go, but I couldn't back down now. "Some things can't be fixed," I said quietly, "but some things can be reclaimed." Robert's face darkened. "You're a disgrace," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "A disgrace to this family and everything we built here. You don't belong in this barn, and you sure as hell don't deserve that land." The auctioneer's voice cut through the tension as he called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin with Lot 247, the Richmond Holdings property consisting of 127 acres of mixed agricultural and development land, including water rights and mineral rights." I took my seat in the middle section, paddle number 67 gripped tightly in my hand. Robert sat 3 rows behind me with his well-dressed partner, their paddles ready. The energy in the barn was electric, as everyone realized this would be more than a simple real estate transaction. Bidding opened at $200,000, well below the property's actual value. Hands shot up around the barn as the auctioneer worked the crowd with practiced skill. Within minutes, we'd climbed to $400,000, then $500,000. Several bidders dropped out as the price exceeded their limits. At $650,000, only 4 bidders remained active. Myself, Robert and his partner, a developer from the state capital, and a local farming cooperative looking to expand their operations. Each bid brought us closer to the point where financial reality would determine the outcome. The auctioneer's chant was hypnotic as the price continued climbing. 700,000, now looking for 725,000. Do I hear 725,000? My paddle went up. 750,000, now 775,000. Robert's partner raised his paddle. The barn was dead quiet except for the auctioneer's voice and the occasional whispered conversation. At $850,000, the developer from the capital dropped out, shaking his head as he put his paddle down. The farming cooperative lasted until $920,000 before their representative indicated they were done. That left just 2 bidders, me and my uncle's team. The price climbed past $950,000, then $975,000, then crossed the $1 million threshold. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented for our rural county. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a battle between past and present, family loyalty and betrayal. At $100,000, Robert's partner hesitated for the first time. I could see them conferring, calculating, trying to determine if they had enough resources to continue. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know about their limitations. "Und 150,000. Do I hear $150,000? The auctioneer's eyes moved between the two remaining bidders. Robert's partner looked strained, clearly at the edge of their financial capacity. I raised my paddle without hesitation. Won $200,000, now looking for $1,225,000. The barn held its collective breath. Robert's partner started to raise his paddle, then stopped. After a whispered conversation with Robert, he shook his head and put the paddle down. $200,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. I felt 15 years of planning, sacrifice, and determination crystallizing into this single moment. Sold to bidder number 67 for $200,000. The barn erupted in applause and excited conversation. I sat stunned for a moment, overwhelmed by the reality that it was over. After 15 years of waiting and working, the land was finally coming home. My grandmother's legacy would be restored, and the wrong that had been done would be made right. People surrounded me with congratulations and curious questions about my plans for the property. Local newspaper reporters appeared with cameras and notebooks, eager to document the story of the city woman who'd paid more than $1 million for rural land that most people thought was worth half that amount. Through the crowd, I caught sight of Robert near the exit. His shoulders were slumped in defeat, his partner already heading for the parking lot. For a moment, our eyes met across the barn. I saw something in his expression that might have been regret or recognition or simply exhaustion. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to savor the victory over the man who'd betrayed our family's trust. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. This shouldn't have been necessary. We shouldn't have been on opposite sides of an auction barn, fighting over land that had been in our family for nearly a century. But it was done now. The deed would be transferred within 30 days, and I would own the property that my great-grandfather had purchased in 1923. The circle would be complete, and my grandmother's legacy would be secure for future generations. The paperwork took 3 weeks to complete. My lawyers worked with the auction company and county officials to ensure every document was properly filed and recorded. Title insurance, surveys, environmental assessments, every detail had to be perfect to avoid future complications. I returned to the county courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in late spring to sign the final documents. The same building where my great-grandfather had recorded his original deed in 1923 now witnessed the property's return to family ownership. There was something poetic about completing the circle in the same place where it had begun. The county clerk was a woman about my age who remembered my grandmother from her childhood. Mrs. Henderson used to bring the most amazing strawberry preserves to the church social every year, she said as we completed the paperwork. Your family was always so generous to everyone in the community. Walking out of the courthouse with the deed in my hand felt surreal. The legal document was simple, just a few pages describing boundaries, rights, and ownership. But it represented so much more than legal title to 127 acres of land. It represented justice, redemption, and the fulfillment of a promise I'd made to myself and my grandmother's memory. I drove directly to the property, parking where our old farmhouse had once stood. The partially completed subdivision looked even more forlorn now that I owned it. Weeds had grown higher through the cracked sidewalks, and several windows in the abandoned houses had been broken by vandals or weather. Standing on land that was officially mine again, I began mentally planning the restoration. The unfinished houses would have to be demolished. The unnecessary roads and sidewalks would be removed. Gradually, carefully, I would return this place to something resembling what it had been when my grandmother tended her garden here. It would take time, money, and patience. But for the first time in 15 years, Time was on my side. The land was secure, the legal battles were over, and the future was mine to determine. 6 months later, the demolition was complete, and restoration had begun. I'd hired a local contractor who specialized in agricultural renovation to remove the subdivision infrastructure and restore the land to farming condition. It was expensive, but watching the concrete disappear and seeing soil exposed to sunlight again was worth every dollar. I'd taken a leave of absence from my consulting firm, moving back to the area temporarily to oversee the restoration project. Living in a rental house just outside town, I was close enough to visit the property daily and far enough away to maintain some distance from the memories. The work was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Each day brought visible progress toward reclaiming what had been lost. Bulldozers that had once destroyed were now being used to restore. Survey stakes that had marked suburban lots were replaced with fence posts marking agricultural boundaries. I decided to return the land to agricultural use, leasing it to local farmers who would grow crops and raise livestock. It wouldn't generate the income that development might have produced, but income wasn't the point anymore. This was about preservation, legacy, and ensuring the land would remain productive for future generations. Word of the restoration had spread throughout the community, generating more positive attention than I'd expected. Local newspaper articles described it as a victory for agricultural preservation over suburban sprawl. Environmental groups praised the decision to restore farmland rather than pursue development. Some people questioned the financial wisdom of spending more than $1 million to restore land that would generate modest agricultural income. They didn't understand that some decisions aren't based on financial calculations. Some things are worth preserving regardless of their economic value. Standing in what would soon be planted fields again, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced in my business career. Success in the city had been measured in contracts won and profits generated. This success was measured in promises kept and legacies preserved. 1 year after the auction, I hosted the first family gathering on the restored property since my grandmother's funeral. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and their children came from across the state to see what had been accomplished and to reconnect with their agricultural heritage. We set up tables under a large tent where my grandmother's house had once stood. The menu included many of her favorite recipes, recreated from memory, and family recipe cards that various relatives had preserved. The conversation was warm, nostalgic, and healing in ways that surprised everyone. Even some extended family members who had supported Robert's original decision to sell the land seemed grateful that it had been restored. They'd watched the development fail and the land sit unused for years, knowing that our family's legacy had been squandered for nothing. Now they could see their children playing on land where they themselves had played as kids. Robert didn't attend the gathering, though he'd been invited. Some family members maintained that his invitation was necessary for true reconciliation, while others felt his presence would be too uncomfortable. In the end, his absence was probably best for everyone, including him. I announced at the gathering that I was establishing a family trust to ensure the land would remain in agricultural use permanently. Future generations would be able to benefit from the property, but no individual would ever again have the power to sell it for development. My grandmother's legacy would be protected forever. As the sun set over fields that were once again growing crops, I felt the presence of previous generations who had worked this soil. My great-grandfather, who had saved railroad wages to purchase these acres. My grandmother, who had taught me to value land over money and legacy over convenience. Even Robert, whose mistakes had inadvertently led to this restoration. The children were playing tag among the apple trees I'd replanted from the original orchard. Their laughter echoed across fields where 5 generations of our family had lived, worked, and dreamed. This was what my grandmother had wanted to preserve, not just land, but continuity, connection, and the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to this story of family redemption and the power of keeping promises across generations. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What part of the world are you listening from, and do you have family land or legacy stories of your own? Please subscribe to the channel for more stories about the connections between past and present that shape our lives today.